Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. We're back after about a week and a half. Delays happen, and we are both very busy and important men with the current events going on around the world. Not only are we commentators, we are partakers. So make of that what you will. I certainly won't elaborate any further because that is just I simply am not allowed to. But we're going to start out with the less significant stuff that you probably didn't hear about this week. Moving into Syria, so not much out of Syria this week beyond a few small scale attacks along the highway to Homs. You've had Syrian troops and even some commanders that have been killed. So, similar to what they tried to do in Daraa around this time a year and a half ago, where, especially with the tribal and regional leaders who flipped loyalties throughout the war, went back and forth, the ones who most recently came to terms with the government and pro government forces. You had some of them who were assassinated by the more hardliners that they used to associate with. You have the slowly but surely increasing push into Idlib, once again confirming we're likely seeing the last summer of Idlib. And again, I will eat my hat if that's not true. Um, you have some Turkish and pro Turkish forces activities near the Turkish occupied zone and the quote unquote SDF border. So it's a rather calm week out of Syria, especially, and also you have the skirmishes along the Euphrates with the various ISIS remnants, as it were, and the SDF. But a rather quiet week in Syria. There was about a week and a half ago Israeli strikes that killed about five in collateral
Ac-
damage in terms of
actually, one dead, five injured.
yeah, one dead, five injured. That's what it
Yeah.
was. That's why I keep you around. But with that being said, and we'll get more into this, especially with the news about Ukraine and Russia. It is this growing trend. We saw this under the Trump administration, especially with Netanyahu. Whenever there was discontent among the Zionists in the quote unquote Tel Aviv government, if you will, even though I know it's based out of Jerusalem, but we don't talk about that here. I personally don't recognize it, but that's aside the point. Uh, with that being said, we see these actions from the Israeli forces, from the Zionist forces, whenever there is a level of dissatisfaction with Washington. And to quote my own mother from tonight, our Dick Clark half dead president. Um, I'm sorry, our Dick
Love that.
Clark half dead president. That's going to be his new name on the show. I know she doesn't listen, but thank you, Mom, for that. That was actually a very insightful take. He's been rather quiet on most issues. He ran his mouth on Ukraine today, which he'll do every once in a while, but has been very quiet about Middle Eastern issues beyond this attempt to salvage the JCPOA, which there was some minor news about that over the past couple weeks. Not really anything worth dedicating time onto the show just yet because just minor machinations. Now, if or when something comes of that, we certainly will bring that up. But just to mention, that is technically an ongoing process as we speak. Some sort of backdoor negotiations with Iran, but nothing too much of note to speak of at the moment. But you can tell there's this pattern, and then, as we mentioned the past couple episodes, you have Naftali Bennett, who is in office now in Israel, who has said he's not going to honor the previous standing agreements with the Russians and with Putin in particular. When it
Yeah.
came to the various diplomatic summits and informal meetings had between Netanyahu and Putin, there was this agreement that didn't entirely prevent Israeli strikes, but it was it sought to curtail them. It sought to
Yeah.
stifle them. And
From what I understand, what happened was the injuries came from ground to ground missiles, not from air to ground missiles. So there were 8 air to ground missiles which were intercepted. That was immediately followed by ground to ground missiles fired from the Israeli side into Syria, which caused the damage and killed one of the Syrian soldiers. Um, Russian jets, two Su-35s, did uh, go after Israeli jets. The Israeli jets did retreat, and there was no further shelling that occurred from ground to ground. Um, it's been basically just a slow attrition. The biggest losses this week have been for ISIS. They've lost about 18 members. Russia is bombing central Syria with a great degree. Idlib is ramping up a little bit. Um, it's a little bit more active than it has been for the last few months. And of course, the exchange between the SDF, the US-backed SDF, and the Turkish jihadist forces back and forth have caused deaths on either side, including civilians. A family was killed that I believe were Kurds. Um, and in Daraa in the south, where the insurrection against Assad began, um, one of these guys that um, about a year ago, or it might have been at the end of 2020, Daraa became very unstable. Then it was pacified. Russian military police went in there, and they took a few of the people who were part of the uprising, and they eventually joined the side of Assad, of the Syrian government. Um, some of these were like they appeared to be like mid-level or higher up mid-level leaders who defected, and this is the second or third person in a year that's been assassinated.
The
That's been
people
that's been
who
reported on.
saw at the beginning of the war that conditions initially favored the opposition and now see that conditions clearly favor Assad. So these people, they likely don't have many strong convictions or principles when it comes to who should rule Syria or many other things and are just trying to preserve their own quote unquote middle management position, so to speak. So that's the kind of
Right.
people we're talking about, which is why we could see what whereas some of the more hardliners would take umbrage with that and again make attempts, sometimes successfully, on their life with assassination attempts. These uh, roadside bombings that you see periodically throughout Syria, but the Middle East has been generally calm. I never thought we'd hear those words, even though I say that's become a running theme on the show. But it seems like the geopolitical flashpoints over the past few years, ever since war with Iran in 2018, 2019, didn't happen despite many people anticipating it, even somewhat including ourselves. The flashpoints have now switched to Europe and East Asia. Now, we don't have much news out of East Asia tonight. Things have been calm there, but we have plenty of news out of both North America and Europe. And I imagine the Ukraine news will probably be a bit bigger, so I guess we can start with dear old Canada and the trucker protest because what I initially thought was going to be a small display of discontent before everyone packed up and went home has quickly ballooned into something much larger than I ever would have thought, to the point where the Canadians have now declared a state of emergency over this. You're seeing a full media assault against the protester movement. You had, there were states in Canada, well, uh, not as in political entities, but states of situations. Canada, we'll put it that way to dispel any confusion, where offering material aid to these protesters would be considered aiding and abetting a crime. Now, we did get somewhat into that last week, but they have ramped that up, and of course, there's cameras trained everywhere. You can't go, you can barely go 5 feet without finding some journalist, whether they are quote unquote mainstream or quote unquote independent, that is filming the every actions of the people there. It hasn't ballooned into violence or revolt yet, despite what you might hear from a lot of mainstream sources, but it has become a movement of popular discontent, to say the least. And, I'm really scared because this is what happens when you let fascism take over democracy. And
In trucks.
yeah, I'm just saying fascism is when you honk. The more you honk, the more fascist it is, and it's real scary stuff. But fortunately, we have some brave heroes known as hackers who are
Oh yeah.
releasing the personal information of normal everyday people, and they had this whole screed. They took some clip from a Disney movie and like one of those like sing songy things. You could tell it was a gay man because not even a woman would put something together like this, as we were discussing off air. And it was just this I saw this and I replied mucho texto. It was just this crawl of words that would put George Lucas to shame. Just going on. The one part I remember in particular was the introduction. Attention, grifters and hatriots. Now, of course, this was for the Give Send to Go website, which is one of those alternatives to GoFundMe, which we were discussing last week, and I said this was a possible risk, and not even that these platforms are necessarily malicious. Now, I believe some of them are. I believe some of them are traps to get you to hand over your personal financial information, but about this one, I hadn't even heard of it until last week, so I really can't tell you much about it. But even with the best intentioned ones, just being a smaller operation and being a less wealthy operation, there's going to be more security breaches than, say, a website like GoFundMe that is established, that is probably a multi-million dollar corporation that operates all over the world. So there's naturally going to be less security measures taken. And they released the personal information and financial information of a bunch of people who donated to these truckers and donated to this cause. Now, what I found particularly funny out of this is there was one case where it wasn't the hacker, but it was somebody who was very involved and very supportive of it, having a meltdown on one of these social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, I can't remember, because they found their parents' name among the donor list, and it was just like it was just paragraphs of ranting and raving, almost as bad as the original message. And welcome my fellow grifters and hatriots to tonight's episode of the War Report, because I've decided definitively we can't call the episode anything else but that, because it's just too good. It wrote like a 14-year-old wrote it. Now it read like a 14-year-old wrote it. Now it may have been. I don't know. I honestly, you're asking the wrong person. I can barely make this computer function enough to do this show, so you're really barking up the wrong tree here. I wouldn't even know where to begin when it comes to something like hacking a website, but I guess lower security. Maybe I don't know. Maybe we have a tech expert in the audience or somebody we can bring on the show to describe this phenomenon more in detail. Because if you want the juicy details of how this happened, you're asking the wrong person. I'm here to explain the fallout and the implications of such actions. But with this, again, I don't think they really accomplished what they wanted to. I doubt many people are going to have their lives ruined over this. This isn't as much as they want to paint it as like some like fringe or far right or fascistic movement. In fact, that was the main claim of the hacker, that they needed to prevent fascism. I'm not sure how big these demonstrations have ballooned in relative size to the cities or areas that they're taking place and the Canadian population in general. Now, of course, being in the globalized world we live in, there were donations all over from the world, especially from the United States. It seems like that border, especially when it comes to the online sphere, is a bit fluid, even though one of the border bridges is actually being blocked as we speak. Not as big as a demonstration as the ones you're getting throughout the Ontario province, particularly. I believe it was Toronto and Ottawa that were having the biggest demonstrations. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But you also did see some results out of some of the more western provinces of Canada. I believe it was Alberta, which
Yeah.
is the very, relatively speaking, at least by Canadian standards, one of the more conservative parts of Canada, was beginning to lift restrictions. I don't know what the current situation is with Quebec, where they wanted to have the health tax for people who didn't take the you know what. So it does look like minor concessions are being made, at least by some localities and some again subnational governments. But time will tell, and it doesn't look like, barring a severe use of force, which of course would drum up its own unpopularity, that they are dislodging these protesters anytime soon. And again, this has forced me to call into question some things as I was discussing last week, last episode, about the nature of grassroots movements. Now, we'll be the first to tell you that, again, most movements come from the top down. That doesn't necessarily make them bad, but change comes when power players decide there need to be change. Whether, and again, there's such thing as, is contradictory as it sounds, as a distant power player, somebody who's more on the periphery of the establishment, more on the periphery of the power structure, who decides they want to make their bid using X, Y, or Z movement. And beyond Elon Musk making some tweets about how this is a good thing, we've seen no, again, major financial support from any wealthy individual or corporations or anything of that sort. So it has been generally grassroots, which I would say does help.
Well, I mean, there's some caveats to that, right? So,
Yes, I'd imagine you would have more to add there, but like especially compared to, and again we're speaking completely relatively, especially compared to something like a Black Lives Matter or an Antifa or any of these left wing movements that's cropped up, but it does seem like at least the origin was maybe there has been some co-opting somewhere along the way, but it does seem like the origin is a bit more authentic than say those other ones. And I know you're speaking of Antifa, there was some interesting collaborations between them and the Canadian state regarding this little. I don't know what you'd call this chaos crisis.
yeah.
But it's like nothing I've ever seen in the Anglosphere before. Like if you were telling me that I don't know, maybe say the French were doing something like this, I would think, okay, wow, that's pretty big, but it's not a surprise considering the fact that it's the country that gave us the yellow vest protest. But again, maybe my perception is skewed about this because this is just something I simply would not have thought I would see come out of the Anglosphere.
Right. So, as we were saying on the last program, this is mostly the majority of the funding came from, um, the energy agricultural Anglo conglomerate in Western Canada. That's who basically did the big funding for the truckers. Now, there was, okay, so it has to be divided into two different sections: the GoFundMe, which reached nearly 10 million, and then the Give Send Go, which reached nearly 9 million. Now, 52% of the funding for Give Send Go actually came from America. So only, the Canadian portion is like 30 some odd, 40%. And then it's coming from other places, but it's mostly American. So now for the GoFundMe, there were large donations that came from, um, the suspicion is that they came from the Conservative Party or people aligned with the Conservative Party who wanted to get rid of O'Toole, and O'Toole is gone. They have gotten rid of him. Uh, and it was very shortly after that GoFundMe was uh, cut off. I believe the mayor of Ottawa, probably at the behest of Trudeau, in conjunction with GoFundMe, are the ones who stopped that account. Now, this is small money. I mean, yes, elites are involved, but it's very small. You're talking about 10 million. It's not 10 million is frankly a joke. I mean, Apple donated $150 million to BLM. And this was weeks after it was obvious what BLM was doing. And GoFundMe didn't stop the account for BLM and their involvement in Chaz,
Yeah, these are like
which,
the bottom of the elite who are donating to this.
right. I mean, also it has to do with the scale. Like Canada simply can't, like Canada doesn't have a population bigger than the tri-state area around New York,
Oh, certainly
right?
not.
So it's only 35 million, and it doesn't have the same level of wealth, and these guys that were funding the truckers. Like I say, I don't know what portion of the GoFundMe they make up, but the idea is that they did it in order to, get rid of O'Toole, which was the leader of the Conservative Party. They thought he was a cuck, and they had to get rid of him. Um, he kind of did sort of what Trump did last year, which was cuck to the left's demands, except he did it for COVID based mandates, and he lost the election because of that. And I think they wanted him to be stronger. Um, the fallout, though, is severe. Before we get into the whole thing with Trudeau, there are now 5 provinces who are stopping or have stopped all the mandates. Some of them, many of them will stop completely by March 1st. So we are only about 2 weeks, some less than 2 weeks, depending on which province you're talking about, where these mandates, even the green passes are going. I would still say that this is a very active situation. It's a very fluid situation. It's uncertain. We were told that 2 weeks to flatten the curve. So take everything with a grain of salt.
And
But
not to
Quebec,
mention all the people who have already capitulated to the you know what demands.
yeah,
Again, it's too late for them. I think the vast majority of Canada is considered, depending on the questions what they do with the boosters, is considered fully inoculated. So, again, despite that they're lifting it, and you could view that as something of a victory, even though I would say once again to address what we were saying previously on the past few episodes, it is something of a breathing room of a transition period. With that, again, a lot of people who have taken this and maybe do suffer negative side effects that certainly don't exist because we've never spread medical misinformation. They have no recourse towards this. I believe it was in France where they were saying that they outright said in France that there was preventions that people who did suffer these negative reactions could not hold the manufacturers of this medication liable. So again, that's getting into a bit of a different topic, but point being is a lot of the damage is already done. Of course, I'm happy about these restrictions going away and hope that they will stay away and hope that we can take advantage of the breathing room as much as possible. But we do have to be honest with ourselves in admitting that a lot of the damage, a lot of what they wanted to do has already been done.
right. So I would say that one of the things that's also happening right now is the focus on the government of Canada right now. I think because in many ways in the West, um, since 2020, you are allowed to fully express yourself, not for the crisis, but for a crisis, which masks the crisis. And what I mean is, the crisis in the West is its own continuation, and it's failing to compete on the world stage, and the divisions it has from within. That is the actual crisis. But the point you can see with the way people react and are encouraged to react within the COVID mandates regime, which delineate very well who is friend, who is foe. They are the mask for the actual crisis, right? You cannot disclose to the public blatantly what the crisis is. So the COVID crisis is a surrogate for that, right? And people act as if it were the crisis about which way the civilization is going, which political ideology is going to win. That's been the crisis in a very heightened way, I think, since late 2015. But every successive year, it becomes more and more acute. And let's say 2020 with COVID and the Floyd riots, uh, I don't think there was anybody who has lived the last 2 years and that doesn't see it, like, will never see it. So
Yeah,
it's why you
anyone
have
who doesn't watch the War Report, that is.
yeah. Yes. Now you can see why Antifa works closely with CSIS, which is it's not technically our FBI, it's kind of like our CIA. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police is our FBI. So But, this is upper strata, federal policing, let's say, to keep things general. And it was Antifa who doxed all those people who were donating, right? As of now, there are no plans to charge everyone who donated, and the charge would be as high as $100,000.
Especially considering the fact, again, half of them are outside their jurisdiction in the United States, so that's a bit
Right,
that's a
right.
bit of a
It's
preventative factor.
Yeah, I think that the whole point of it is to terrify the public, right? Uh, the convoy itself does not have popular support. I would say figures that I've seen indicate around 35% popular support, and it probably has more support depending on the province and sometimes depending on the region in the province, right? However, the lifting of mandates, all of them, from QR codes, digital IDs, vaccinations, masks, you name it, overwhelmingly people want this gone. And you can see Trudeau was very clever in saying that don't mistake that COVID fatigue is the same thing as these truckers, right? And he's completely lied and misrepresented them. Uh, on the weekend, I did go to see what was happening, not in Ottawa, but my friend had gone to Ottawa to speak with some of the truckers and how they're making out. These guys they're basically like on their last leg right now, and they do enjoy a lot of popular support there. Not in the city because there are counter protesters. Some of the truckers have had their, um, not the big trucks, but the pickups who have joined them. And you have to understand, some of them, their families are there too. The father might be in the big rig, but the house, the rest of the household is in a truck or a car. But they've had their tires slashed, and he spoke to some of the shit libs there and everything, and he kind of his positions are very Nazgul, so he confused a lot of the shit libs that were there. Um, but I maintained that all of this is a way for people to get angry, not about the actual issue, because in a sense that issue is so enormous. Um, but it is the issue, and you could argue that what's happening now in Ukraine probably better represents this civilizational struggle than does any other current news. Um, I went down to Niagara, and there was a small group there that were protesting, and there was a guy from India that was there, and uh, there was a guy who used to live in Alberta who was there that I spoke to. I anyways, I won't get into it, but very, very nice man. And I also spoke to some of the locals around there. Now, um, and there was a Polish guy. So I spoke to him for a while. And at one point, I was dropping just like a few truth bombs, and I think, or at least my speculations. Let's say not truth bombs, but my take. And I said basically this to him. I said, as time moves forward economically in the West, life will become more difficult. And the government knows that this has the potential of the society dividing into its ethnic components, also dividing along more acutely along ideological differences. And one of the reasons that they want the digital passport forever, if they can, and like I already mentioned, it's not certain that's going to be the case. However, if you go to the government website, you can voluntarily get a digital passport. You can get it now. It doesn't even matter, like, if your province doesn't do it, you can get it anyways. So in any case, I said to him, one of the reasons why they'll still probably push for a digital passport, maybe not for this quote unquote crisis, but the next crisis, is they want to stay on top of that. They want to be able to monitor that. And At the moment, America is not able to fully compete with Russia and China united. And this is causing division inside. And you can see how, with us here, everything is blamed on the Russians. The Russians must be funding this. Now, the CBC even had a former intelligence officer literally state this. He is convinced the Russians are funding this. What he's doing is he's running cover basically for Canada, which is generous because I think in the States that wouldn't have happened. But essentially, he wants to conceal that conservatives did some, the conservative political party probably did some of the bigger chunks of the funding for the truckers, and so it's convenient to blame Putin, whose next devilish plan was to get truckers to honk. Um, so um, I think their mouths just kind of dropped because I don't think they ever saw this angle. Like, I think they understood these ideas compartmentalized, separate from one another, but not working within a whole, right? So they understood that things economically, things are not getting better. Inflation is through the roof. The civilization seems to be getting more authoritarian, but they're not linking why that's the case. Why is that happening, right? And I think the way I said it, like they just had no words to say. Their mouth just dropped. We did afterwards go to Windsor, but we didn't get there in the evening. And when we got there in the morning, when we woke up in the morning to go see what was going on, they had sectioned off that entire area. It was more cops than protesters. There were like about a dozen arrests. I couldn't get close. At one time, I asked my friend to wait for me in the parking lot. Now I walk right between two cop cars. That this cop was on his phone. At one point, he finally noticed him after I passed him. He goes, "Hey, you! Where are you going?" And I turn around and go, "What's wrong?" And he sees that I have cameras, and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry. Listen, I didn't mean to frighten you, but no one can go there." I go, "Not even pedestrians, eh?" And he goes, "No, not even pedestrians." I go, "Okay, just didn't know." Um, so this is around now. I have
I'm
to say,
sorry,
we
but do
did.
you know how badly I wanted that story to end in you either speaking Russian or Macedonian?
Oh, can you imagine, right?
You would be in
You
a
call it,
black site and not doing the show. That's what would have
yeah,
happened.
that's right. I should have said "До свидания." I mean, as if they could, as if they would know, right? But yeah, that would have been funny. Yes, as a third person, if someone recorded that, would be hilarious. But um, yeah, so we drove off basically. There was nothing. There was really nothing to do. I couldn't get anywhere near the area because they had really sequestered everything off. There was one armored vehicle, at least one that I saw, that was sort of patrolling the area. Um, but yeah, so I think those are my major takes on the whole fiasco. Now, what happens next? I don't know. The Ontario Premier Doug Ford said that there will be no digital IDs anymore. But there's all kinds of rumors. We'll just have to wait till March the 1st. Like I say, it's a fluid situation.
Yeah, that is a very it's very precarious. I couldn't even begin to make a prediction. The show is all about making very highbrow predictions, but I suppose here we are. I will say, um, despite some of the reasons for skepticism, despite some of the reasons for pessimism, I still remain relatively optimistic, and I suppose we'll just have to introduce this to the the Slavic soul to see how pessimistic should we be, my Slavic friend.
uh, Not too optimistic. I mean, if we talk about strategy, right? Like, I think I think, I mean, Trudeau's not a great leader. Like, he's a very stiff, very restrained person. Every time he speaks, he literally sounds like he rehearsed 5 minutes ago. There is something unbelievably rehearsed and cardboard about him. Um, he did not have, like, he didn't, Macron, like, because, I guess all our listeners know, right? Like, even Israel has like a trucker convoy now. So all these countries, Belgium, France, New Zealand, um, there's many, many that like have trucker convoys of one kind or another. Um, so it has ballooned, and of course this one that's supposed to happen in March in the US. We'll see how that goes. Um, but he hasn't acted. He can't go hard the way Macron does. Like, Macron can be an absolutely brutal guy. He really can. Like, I don't know if I mentioned this. Maybe way back, but when I was following the Yellow Vests in 2019, and I spoke to one of the leaders, at least one of the organizers for that march, a year later he lost his eye from a rubber bullet. So, um, and there have been at least 3 deaths. 17 hands have had to be amputated. Oh, sorry, about 8 hands had to be amputated. 18 people have lost an eye. So very serious injuries. Um, I would, the other thing is it hasn't made that much. I mean, it has made the news rounds, but they're not fixated on it. So in Coots, which is out in Western Canada, apparently there were a group of men who were part of the protest there. I don't know if they were the truckers or not. I can't say one way or the other, but apparently they had, the 11 guns were seized. So now, was this like was the fix in, I would think like this would be front and center news, but I don't see it as often as I do see news reports about whatever it is that Friedman or Trudeau has said about the truckers and what's going to happen next and so on and so on. But there is only one center now, and that's in Ottawa. That's where um, the main protest is still going. As I understand it, if the truckers pull their hydraulic brakes, I presume take the keys with them, removing the trucks will be very laborious. So I don't know. I think
Comically so, as a matter of fact.
yeah, like I think what Trudeau is doing is he's going to wait this out. That's what I think he's going to do. There is some momentum on his side, but politically he's kind of losing it. It may be that even his own supporters or his own handlers are thinking it's time to get rid of him because of the weakness of his response. Of course, the we haven't even mentioned that he has enacted the like the War Measures Act, which his father enacted, but that was during the FLQ crisis where one politician was assassinated. There were two or three that were kidnapped and so on. This is not quite like that. He has had to. He has been criticized by different MPs that he has jumped the gun, including one from Quebec. And like I say, 5 provinces so far have dropped all the mandates or will drop all the mandates by March, by the 1st of March. So less than 2 weeks from now. What is that going to do to him politically? I don't know. There is a strong base support. Like the Liberal Party has basically run Canada almost the entire 20th century and for most of the 21st now, or a good chunk of it, anyways. Um, we did have the years with Harris, who was a conservative, but um, I would say that I think knowing him, he's going to hold out. The army already has not. I have not heard news that the army has changed its mind and it's going to go and remove the truckers. So I think he's going to do kind of like a soft version of Macron, where he just wastes them out, and the
Yeah,
media will just
it's
stop
quite
reporting
literally
on it.
a Canadian version of Macron. It's
Yeah.
and speaking of which, since you did bring him up before and also now, and also make that transition into Europe, it will be interesting to see how he plays his hand going forward because we are about a month and a half out from the first rounds from the French elections, and you have both Le Pen and Zemmour, among other candidates, who are pulling decently where Macron's future doesn't look certain. If I had to make a broad prediction, I think he'll pull it off by the skin of his teeth in the first round
Hmm.
and probably pretty comfortably in the second round. Um, a repeat of last time, especially considering the fact I don't think he's done too much to get on the bad side of the established powers. He did have his moments of independence there, but I do think he has their blessing when it comes to that when they look at the current state of the American empire, and that his more adventurous side is actually somewhat welcomed by those people. Now we'll see how that
Hmm.
moves on going forward. But the big story of the night, I suppose, Russia and Ukraine. So it looks like Putler has finally done it. He is ordered a mass mobilization of Russian troops back to their permanently stationed bases. And the buildup on the Ukrainian border is actually currently decreasing as, again, you hear in the Western media, February 16th, 2022, at 1 a.m., Russia will invade. They narrowed down the exact time and date of which the Russian invasion will take place, and not only are we supposed to believe that, but we're supposed to believe after this has been exposed to the mainstream media in the West that they would still follow through with such a plan because, of course, they have a very one-dimensional view of the world. It should come to surprise to nobody. But with reality, you've seen this for the past several months, actually, since November. I think we're about on month three of this. Just month three in a few days over. I believe it was November 7th, November 8th when this most recent crisis, quote unquote, started in this overarching Russia Ukraine conflict. And with that being said, there are, of course, Ukrainian reports of Russian troops uh, starting to, again, pull back from the border. The European media throughout various countries, whether it be particularly Germany, other Eastern Europeans, uh, and otherwise, have said there's no real risk of war. But it's been the Anglo-American media that has really convinced the general public, at least in the English-speaking world, that war is imminent, that it's about to be World War III, that Putin is very aggressive at the moment, and that we can only expect a Russian invasion of Ukraine unless we stand up to it. And just backtracking to Canada a bit, Trudeau did pledge, I believe it was about 6.5 million in aid to the Ukrainians in anticipation of a Russian attack. You've had also the continuation of NATO countries outside of the, again, Anglo-American bloc, and even Poland have been showing a general disinterest in this. But I suppose the main news this week is the American and British evacuations and destruction of sensitive information in their embassies, really trying to
Hmm.
drum up this idea that an invasion is imminent and that they need to escape the country. There were reports of a singular helicopter going from Kiev to the Polish border, with, I believe they reported one passenger on board. So I guess the oligarchs are also a bit paranoid, which makes me think with the destruction of documents with that sort of evacuation, it does really make me think, well, what now? What are they actually trying to cover up? What's so pertinent in the embassy in Kiev that they're going to go through the effort of shredding all their documents, burning all their documents, and destroying their computers? Because clearly, unless the State Department has bought into its own narrative to the point where they are really doing this, clearly there's something else afoot. They're using this as an excuse to
Yeah.
destroy some other sensitive documents. I don't know. Were we on the breach of a major leak from? I don't imagine it to be WikiLeaks nowadays. I think ever since the Assange fiasco, they've been pretty quiet. But point being, were we at risk of some major leak out of the U.S. Embassy in Kiev that would have revealed this entire thing to be a pile of crap? Or I still haven't quite worked that out yet, but I can only imagine there's something that we don't know about that we will probably hear more about in the coming months. Or maybe it's just the final excuse to throw up the white flag on this Ukrainian revolution project, on this Maidan project, and say, hey, this was a complete and total failure and we won out. I don't know, perhaps they were just showing the documents that may have implicated him in that. But even according to the current narrative of that, the fear of a Russian invasion has been in the areas that have a large amount of separatist activity, in the Donbass and in
Mhm.
eastern Ukraine in general. Not even the most hawkish of neoconservatives, not even the most shameless of warmongers, have said that Russia plans on the full annexation of Ukraine. Now, there were some more outlandish takes, like, for example, Russia's going to take over the entirety of southeastern Ukraine and then use that and invade Moldova, invade right up to the NATO border in Romania, and that's why we have to have troops in Romania. But again, I I see no evidence of that. I see no real evidence of that. Not that I care too much about the great sovereignty of either Ukraine or Moldova, even though personally I do draw the line at Moldova. That is rightful Romanian territory. However, I also won't defend Romania's membership in NATO, so I'm a bit conflicted here. Okay, so we will
Mhm.
put that aside. We're getting more into minutia than anything, and the general narrative of an invasion. Again, what it's been for the past several weeks, as we've time and time again repeated, is that it's the Anglo-American media, the English language media, that is really drumming up this idea that a Russian invasion is imminent, whereas literally nobody else, including the Ukrainians, believe that it is. Now, there were some people thinking that, oh, this is really going to be the time, and again, there's simply nothing of that. There was a bill introduced by one of the MPs in the Russian legislature to recognize the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk
Mhm.
republics. Now, again, I think that's just the usual theatrics that go on in the Duma because, as we were discussing previously, with the Russian political system, with how centralized power is, at least outside the legislature, I'm not saying that Putin has complete power, that he's completely dictator. He still has a lot of interests that he needs to answer to, like really any politician or ruler would need to. But we've discussed previously where the Duma, because of its more minor role in Russian politics, is able to have these more theatrical shows. There's a reason why people like Zhirinovsky are leaders of major parties.
Yeah.
It's again quite literally the infusion of politics and entertainment because they know that it's a rubber stamp parliament. They're just going to go along more or less with what the Kremlin wants. Now, of course, I'm not saying that they're completely powerless. If they really want to stonewall some move out of the executive, they probably could, but I imagine there would have to be some massive loss of confidence in Putin. And speaking of which, that's also another narrative they're trying to drum up. They have this anonymous Russian general who seems to change every time, saying that, well, Putin's just drumming up an invasion of Ukraine to save his own internal popularity. Now, admittedly, yes, politicians do often talk about foreign issues and issues of national pride, so to speak, when they want a general push towards popularity. But it's more of this Russia is finished any day now, Putin is finished any day now narrative. And I believe they dug up this general, this guy who's been retired for 20 years and has really just been out of the game up until recently. I think he's part of some NGO that is. It's not quite as bad as, say, a Navalny, but he's saying, like, oh, Putin is just trying to walk a tightrope because he's afraid that if he doesn't uh, if he doesn't convince Russia that they're invading Ukraine, then he might get overthrown. Or again, the sort of crap the English language media always puts out there. But another astute observation I've noticed from several people is that despite this being the brink of war, it doesn't really seem like the media in Russia and that even the state-backed media have done much to drum up war propaganda, have done much to drum up a Russian sentiment that, oh, we have to fight the Ukrainians. And I'll also default back to the point that we've been making for years now. Barring any massive incident, it would have to be massive, in my opinion at least, there are too many familial ties between the Russian Ukrainian border for there to really be an effective war. Because not only is there the sentiment, and I would say, of course, this is more so on the Russian side, that these people are co-ethnics, but again, quite literal familial ties in terms of extended family. As we've said before, about a quarter to a third of the people in Moscow are either of some sort of Ukrainian extraction or have Ukrainian surnames. And again, there is just from the centuries that they have been under the same polity, whether that be the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are very intertwined nations, down to, again, down to just individual extended families. That's how deep these roots run, and that's once again just me hammering the point home that it would take a lot for Russia and Ukraine to go to war, and I simply don't see that now. And of course, you also see the points again that we need to punish Putin even if he does withdraw, even if he doesn't go through with this invasion. And once again, barring an outright embargo, which would be also very harmful to our partners in Europe, and we'll get into some of the stuff with Nord Stream and the pipelines here, there's really not much else that can be done economically. The harshest sanctions we've spent the past 8 years between America and the other Western countries already putting those on Russia. Those cards have already been played. So, barring a forceful military response or an outright embargo or some sort of international isolation of Russia, which simply is not going to happen, they're not going to turn Russia into a snowy Iran as much as they would like to. They either have to give up on this Ukrainian fantasy or back it up with bullets. There's really no other way to do it because, again, while I think the ultimate goal among some of these more outlandish people would to be to turn Russia into a snowy Iran, that simply is not on the table with their position in the world stage already and with their close relationship to China. That is simply not on the table. And even, again, Iran is a bad example as of late because Iran is being integrated into the Chinese and to a lesser extent the Russian bloc. So I really don't know what their angle is here. I really
Yeah.
don't know what else they plan to do. I mean, at this point, it's honestly just saving face. Beyond, of course, the ethnic and ideological considerations of the more Ukrainian people, they have to stand by Ukraine because they can't give Russia a victory. But they're also in the position where they can't back up their support of Ukraine beyond a few $1 million in aid here and there and some statements of support. And already, NATO has announced that Ukrainian membership is off the table for the foreseeable future. The Ukrainians who made that as part of their constitution, that ascension into NATO and integration into Europe was a goal, even the Ukrainian government has started to have second thoughts about something like that. So effectively, Russia has won. That's why the troops are going home right now. That's why the troops are returning to their regular bases, which some of which are more towards Moscow, out further east near China and Japan, etc. Point being is this mass mobilization, quote unquote mass mobilization on the Ukrainian border, a lot of it is being disbanded as of now because Russia has gotten what they want. They saber rattled enough, and really, they made the West look like complete and utter fools, at least in my personal opinion. And they got them to outright say, which we all already knew, that Ukraine will not be joining NATO.
Right. And there is a kind of a panic, and I have a kind of I have a theory, right? Like, Schultz, the Chancellor of Germany, was in Moscow today, um, which is the 15th of February, and it was brought up that the Duma, as you said, voted for the breakaway republics. And again, I stress these republics do not like they don't even control like 50% of the actual republic territory, right? They only control about, I would say, 38 to 41% of their respective territories. So um I do think that though that plays some kind of a role. Like there's some things about this that don't make sense. And that is so Schultz going there in the first place is not a move that you would think the Chancellor of Germany would do if he thought, in the next 12 hours war would break out. and Bolsonaro is going to be there tomorrow. He'll probably like, it's 7 hours ahead, so he'll probably be landing in a few hours in Moscow. That too doesn't look like there is an invasion. And then lastly, we have Shoigu, who's basically like General Milley of of the Russian forces, but not gay.
Yeah,
Who
he's just Genghis Khan. You
Yeah,
ever see
he's
the
Genghis
guy?
Khan. He's actually Ukrainian. I don't know if people know that. And so
Ukrainian and Turkic. What a combination! And one of the most,
I know.
and
So
one of
he
Russia's fiercest warriors. Go figure.
Right. So he's in Syria actually. He flew out and he's been in Syria for like the whole day meeting Assad and so on. So if there was really going to be an invasion, um, the actions within Russia and actions of foreign leaders going into Russia don't seem to indicate that that's the case, and that's kind of taking the wind out of their sails. Now, you mentioned that America, is destroying all their documents in their embassies and all these countries. Like first it was like five, then eight, then 12, and like now it's like over 20 countries are leaving their embassies. They've literally taken their flags away. Now America's embassy temporarily has been moved to Lvov, which is in the west of the country, close to the Slovak Polish
Yeah, up
border.
in the Carpathians.
Yeah, and of course, much against the displeasure of the Slovak public, America has convinced the Slovak authorities in the government there to accept American jets at one of their Air Force bases.
Yeah, I don't have the
But
polling figures on hand, but I saw it going around the other day about various European countries where they would stand on an American-Russian war, and most of them were neutrality. And then the second largest for most of them were support America and NATO and their obligations. And really, the only country that had a more pro-Russia than pro-America stance was Slovakia, which
yeah,
I thought was
I don't know what it is, but Slovaks do get along with the Russians quite well. And I've noticed this many years ago. So
I do think it has something. It does play into that sort of late 19th, early 20th Pan-Slavic mythology, if you will.
yes,
Not saying
yeah,
that, of course, there's mythology as in like a grand narrative, not as in it's necessarily fake, but whereas people like say the Czechs or the Poles and even some of the South Slavs have been more disillusioned with that. It seems to be a very strong narrative still in Slovakia. Slovakia is a very interesting case, which
yeah. There have been some like right-wing groups in Slovakia that are sympathetic. I mean, these are tiny, they're small. I don't want to inflate this,
yeah, but
but
like even
um,
like general public, like they're not Russophilic, so to speak, but by and large, I would say based on the polling data I've seen, your average Slovak doesn't have a problem with Russia, especially compared to somebody like your average Pole or average Czech or average Ukrainian, if you will. And
right.
with all that being said, so just hammer home the point of European neutrality, there is that as well. And in terms of diplomatic moves that would indicate war is not imminent, Orban has also been to Moscow within the past week and a
Yeah,
half as well. So I know
right.
he's the renegade of the European Union, but I don't think if you thought that NATO and Russia were on the brink of war, unless he was going to make some brave diplomatic move. Which, knowing him, he might be the guy to try to be like, I'm going to save the world through my negotiation sort of thing. But it was a very run of the mill routine visit,
Right.
as he's been doing over the past 3 4 years. And
Now, Macron was there also just a few days ago
yes,
as well.
there's that wonderful image of them sitting on opposite ends of the very long table. I saw it
Yeah,
going around. But again, every sign on the ground points to the fact that there simply will not be a war, even with the uh, fear mongering and the running of chops of the Anglo-American media. It simply doesn't point to that. Of course, their other one
yeah.
was,
So I just,
what if Russia stages a false flag attack and we're not plotting one ourselves or anything? And again, I still maintain the opinion after 2 or 3 times in Syria, the idea of the false flag, and especially the color revolution entering into common parlance after the 2020 election, at least in conservative circles, a lot of what the American foreign policy establishment did throughout the 2010s, a lot of that has either severely diminished returns or is simply off the table.
Right, and we could still be in another media managed perception game here because, as I said, you have all these actions taking place, within 24 hours of the beginning of the so-called war, and but you also have, of course, all these embassies being locked up in Kiev, and you also have chartered flights, about 20 of them, that are whisking away. Basically the people who were responsible for the 2014 Maidan coup. You have oligarchs like Viktor Pinchuk, Vadim Novinsky, Alexander Yaroslavsky, Andrei Stanivnitzer, Vadim Nestorenko, Vadim Stolar, and Vasily Klimnitsky that are fleeing the country. And this is kind of bizarre to me, right? And you also have other government officials that are leaving. You had this
Dual
uh,
citizenship gets you very far, if you know what I mean.
Yes, and speaking of that, Igor Abramovich, who is the leader of the For Life party, that's the opposition leader. He's leaving. 37 deputies from the ruling party, Servant of the People, are leaving as well. So this is the part that for me makes almost no sense, right? Um, so all these people are leaving. Zelensky is there asking what the hell is going on. He had that conversation with Biden over the phone last week where he told Biden to calm down. And, the basic idea, I think, is that, I mean, we already saw this before. In April 2021, Zelensky was ready to solve the Donbass situation militarily. So he began amassing between 90 to 110,000 troops along the border for an invasion. Donbass at best has like 35,000. So they're severely outnumbered. However, Russia started amassing their military along Ukraine's border, and he backed off. I don't think this is, unless there's a gay op, I don't think this is any different. But the extent to which they're going to convince you that it's not a gay op is really extraordinary, right? Um, I mean, right now, technically, it is the 16th of February in Ukraine. So, you know, if there's an attack in the morning, which is often the case, we're like basically what 3 hours away max from the war to start. If you wait till midnight, it'll be 7 a.m. there. I mean, if it's going to start, it should start around then. So we'll see if there's a gay op tonight or not.
And that's as of time recording. You guys will be seeing this
Yeah,
around 5 o'clock Eastern Time Wednesday with the way that we usually upload these episodes. I don't know. Maybe we'll have to eat our hats over this entire episode. Maybe all our predictions will be wrong, but I don't know. I think we have a pretty decent track record. But
yeah. And I think
if
the other thing to keep in mind for the larger picture in Ukraine is, um, how this works, how it integrates with Nord Stream 2, right? We've mentioned that the Americans deeply want to cancel Nord Stream 2. Now, the Biden administration, in a
maybe
sense,
they
by
should
a
just dig
hair.
up some of Gazprom's racist tweets from 10 years ago. I'm sorry. I had to.
Gazprom, our gas company. So, um, it looks like Biden stopped that from happening, and that did puzzle me. Like, why not just stop it? And I think I have to give credit here to the Duran, especially Alexander Mercurius. So I think he made a lot of sense of it, right? We've always maintained on this show that Nord Stream 2 is a very big deal, or it has become a very big deal for America and for some other NATO partner countries. Not for Germany and France, who are the two biggest and wealthiest countries in the EU, but definitely for like the little Baltic states, Poland and the UK, not to mention America.
Countries
And what
whose
he said
entire
basically is,
national identity and national strategy at that point relies on them being the strong bulwark against Russia, as it were.
Right, right. So I think that, as Mercurius pointed out, um, it is because the Democrats, and we've spoken about the difference between Democrats and Republicans, and Democrats are more savvy overall. They're generally more intelligent. They generally run the show anyways, regardless of whether a Republican is in power or not. But I think what Biden wants, because there have already been so many sanctions placed on Germany, is they need compliance from Germany. Germany has to sabotage itself. They cannot look like they forced Germany to do this. So this is one of the reasons the Democrats rallied and stopped from further sanctions against Nord Stream 2. So the basic idea is when Schultz last week visited America, he was, I think, I mean, you can see just from the way the press reacted, and Biden saying, I can stop it now if I want to, you know, very hubristically. So what he wants is, I mean, the talk that he probably gave him was, uh, cancel Nord Stream 2, or there's going to be a war, right? Now, the counter argument to that is America, again, just like last year, wanted Zelensky to solve this issue militarily. I've already spoken about how Merkel didn't want to put the sanctions on Russia right away until after she found out the battle where essentially the Ukrainians lost. And then she did put on the sanctions. But what she was really hoping for was that the Donbass republics would lose, and then there would be no need to place any sanctions. That's why she dragged her heels. In this situation, you have like two kind of opposing theories, right? So one theory is that the Americans are pushing Zelensky to start this war, right? We can't back down. You have to do this. The Russians amass. And then, because remember, the Ukrainians started slowly amassing first, and then the Russians put their forces there, essentially telling the Ukrainians, like, you're going to get completely smoked. Like, you're going to lose everything if you do this. So the Ukrainians halted, essentially, right? Now, skirmishes are still going on. Villages are still getting bombed. The odd person is killed, almost every other day anyways, but no large scale attack is allowed to happen, essentially. So the other that's one theory. And now the Biden administration is telling Zelensky, just take the deal, follow Minsk. And I think this is why Putin is also sticking to Minsk, also because he wants to redirect where Ukraine goes. Because Ukraine now has become the state that just cannot tolerate any minorities in it anymore. And so it's starting with the Russians, but other minorities are
Unless
affected
they
as
are
well.
gay, okay,
Yes.
that's the only minority. If you're LGBTQ CIA, that's completely
That's
fine.
okay.
We embrace
That's the
that.
kind of minorities we like to
If
see.
you're Russian, if you're Romanian, if you're Hungarian, if
Or
you're
Greek.
Rusin,
2 Greeks were killed
yeah, like
this
if
week.
you're any of those, no, get out of my country. But if you like to take it up the rear from other men, you are a proud Ukrainian who needs to get on the front lines.
Yeah, I mean, these organizations, they're not even worthy of being called nationalists, to be honest. So I would say that, so the other theory is this: Schultz is being pressured to cancel Nord Stream 2, to take the burden off the US, looking like it forced them to do it. Now, if the war happens, then Germany is going to face a lot more pressure, and it will then have to cancel Nord Stream 2. So those are the two basic theories, right? Now, I would say that let's stick with Nord Stream 2, because I think that this is the one that's more interesting. Like, for Russia, it doesn't mean that much. Russia at first hesitated to take Nord Stream 2 because it was already in 2015 directing its focus on Asia. We've already discussed on this show, just like the last one, that the largest gas transfer in the world is between Russia and China. It's not with Europe. Power of Siberia 2 is half complete, and another one that might be coming from Kamchatka or the Chukchi region, which is even further east. Um, this is speculation on my part because it hasn't received a name and it's not Siberia 3, for instance. So that's in the works. The blueprints are being drawn up for that. Siberia Power 2 is half completed anyways. So, like, in terms of revenue, like, it doesn't bother Russia, right? It's a question of what it's going to do to Europe and what it's going to do to Germany. Now, buying American gas will be somewhere between 34 to 40% more expensive. And industrially, Germany cannot keep up. So this could be an example of where, again, the Anglos unite in order to keep Germany down and Russia out, right? If that's going to make, and now it will make all of Europe poorer. There's no question about that. It will definitely make Poland poorer because Poland has all these manufacturing deals with Germany, with German companies, and it has a lot of German investment, right? If you like gas prices right now are already through the roof in Europe, far worse than they are here, and they're very bad in Canada and the U.S., but they're even worse in Europe. To go along with what America wants, it would be like this forever. So America is essentially is telling Schultz, you're going to be sacrificed anyways. So you decide how you want to be sacrificed, because you can be sacrificed without a war, where you cancel Nord Stream 2, and then we supply you with more expensive gas. You figure out how to survive after that. But at least there's no war in Europe. Or you can go against me and there's going to be a war and so on and so on. So that's a theory that I'm sort of playing with as the bigger picture. Um, let's say that but that would mean, the other one where this is a repeat of April 2021 is not the case, or it just looks like that. But the real issue is with Germany and Nord Stream 2. So I could see that because in a way, like for America to maintain its power and uh, you, it needs Europe. It has it has slowly begun to lose many areas, and but Europe is crucial.
And we've
And
already seen the so-called pivot to Asia under both Obama and Trump. While they are putting
yeah,
more emphasis on the East Asian region as it becomes more significant, neither of them have forsaken Europe because it's too vital for the
yes,
American strategy. It's not necessarily that we're so dependent upon any economic productivity or resources in Europe. It's more so that we can't afford to let anyone else have it. It's more so about depriving,
right.
say, Russia or China or even an internal European bloc. It's that we need to keep the Europeans down. Even if it is a small cost to us, it's cheaper than dealing with a not necessarily a hostile Europe, but a Europe that isn't subservient to our interests.
Right. And, Pepe Escobar had an article 2 years ago about this, about how America will try. And this is why Britain is on America's side. And I personally think that Brexit was a disagreement between America's elites, not all that different, although the issues are vastly different, but not all that different between the disagreements between the elites in Canada over, let's say, the truckers and getting rid of O'Toole and so on. And that is Brexit. Like Brexit prepares Britain to be like the forward spear for American interests in Europe, because in many ways, like that reconnection that happened in the 1890s between Britain and America was Britain sensing that they were not going to be the imperial power forever and that they had reached their zenith. And so you had a lot of influential people who came to America to ask for aid because they knew that they would involve themselves in a war with Germany, that was crucial, that destroying Germany and Russia was an absolute necessity.
And they went the whole
Or,
9 yards, and even America, despite not being a country with any nobility or monarchy, they married their children off the American elites. Winston Churchill being the
Yeah,
product of one such marriage, where
exactly,
they
exactly.
they went that step further to solidify that our destinies are now intertwined. And of course,
Right.
the both the world wars are can be seen as an example of really. Now, of course, there's deeper factors, but one of the main goals of the Anglo-American Acts at that point was to put Germany and Russia at odds with each other, because one of the key platforms of Bismarck's foreign policy moving into the late 19th and early 20th century after the unification of Germany was, we don't want to make an enemy out of Russia. It is going to be our undoing if we find ourselves at war with Russia. Now, the Russians were also of a similar attitude where we simply cannot match the Germans. Sure, we have more manpower, we have more land, we have more whatever, but the Germans are some of the most preeminent industrial people in the world, and one of the most skilled uh, races of
And
warriors,
intelligent.
if you will. And yes, intelligent, innovative, anything, any German stereotype you can put there. And it was really the stroking of ego and investments from the French and the British that was one of the large parts of World War One, one of the large parts of it, because throughout I believe it was from 1905 onward, after Russia had lost their war with Japan and had their internal strife, where they started accepting a large amount of Anglo-French investments. Now, that led to the fear in Germany that, of course, Russia is being courted by, of course, their preeminent enemies at that point, and not to
Hmm.
mention with the amount of capital and aid that they're pumping into Russia by, I believe I can't remember which one of the German strategists it was going into World War One. I think it might have actually been Schlieffen himself who said that if we wait a few more years, by I believe actually 1917, ironically enough, was their prediction that Russian rail capacity would be enough to not only fend off a German war, but actually amount to defeating them. Because in World War One, I actually believe I went on this tangent, either last episode or the episode before this. In World War One, Russia actually did, until the collapse of the monarchy and the subsequent October Revolution, did hold out against Germany. Actually, made advances against Austria and Turkey. And the main handicap of Russia in World War One was that their rail system was underdeveloped. Industrial output, that was fine, but the stories you hear about soldiers not having boots or rifles or whatever equipment was a logistical problem, not necessarily a manufacturing problem. And the big fear of the Germans at the time was, once Russia has a proper rail system and has a proper means of distributing what they can manufacture, then it's going to be a very difficult war for us. So we want to uh, take advantage of the conditions in order to strike first if we have to. And again, you see early on in World War One battles such as Tannenberg, absolute humiliations to the Russians. And pretty much until then, it's more or less a stalemate against Germany proper. Whereas with the Ottoman War and with the war against Austria, there were times, even especially in 1916, especially with Austria, where it seemed like Russia had the advantage there. But I'm getting off on too much of a tangent. But point being is, this idea goes back centuries. Is what I think you're getting at.
It
And
does. And in the Salisbury letter to, I believe it would have been Prince George, who was the son of Queen Victoria when she was still alive. He met and he basically outlined that the two uh, biggest threats to British hegemony were Germany and Russia, and the first order was to destroy Germany and then Russia, but Russia economically and from within, and Germany from without. And of course, Britain made the promise that if the Allied powers were successful, then Russia would have a say in Constantinople. Of course, they were never going to honor that. Um,
writing checks they certainly could not cash, which, again, a lot of us know about the German facilitation of Lenin back into Russia after the February Revolution. But again, there was a lot of Anglo money, a lot of Wall Street money involved in that too, as I'm sure.
yes, yes, there was. And
Yeah, Jacob Schiff, I believe we've discussed all of this before.
Jacob Schiff, right? And also there was another guy who was the CEO of Morgan, which later, Morgan Stanley Chase, whatever. But he set up the Red Cross in just to take care of the Bolsheviks. And when Trotsky asked Woodrow Wilson for rifles in 1918, the revolution was morphing into a civil war. Uh, yeah, Woodrow Wilson supplied the rifles, right? I always think it's funny when people talk about Bezmenov and like don't even know this history,
Yeah, like I
or
said,
or like
Bezmenov,
when
if like he's your first exposure that like intelligence agencies run psyops in other countries. It's very informative, but there's not much to it beyond that. But I don't know. That's like if you're still in Bezmenov at this point
it's
after
low
hearing
tier.
yeah
It's
after
low
hearing about it
tier.
for like 5, 6, 7 years at this point, like yeah, I can understand the appeal at first. I think we all. I think he opened the door for a lot of us that clipped it. And again, if you're somebody who's completely new to this, there's some very insightful stuff said in there, but you also have to remember that's from the perspective of a spurned Ukrainian dissident from the USSR whose main gripe was they wouldn't let him marry his beautiful Indian wife.
Yes. And the other thing to keep in mind, right, is uh, America brought over the Frankfurt School before World War II even began, and three of the Frankfurt School members helped transition the OSS into the CIA. So like what Bismanov doesn't understand is that America was already on this road long before his time, and they had an idea of like Besmanov's idea is very like it's very simplistic. He doesn't understand that the Americans want to create a kind of soft left as opposed to a hard left, a non-totalitarian
Yeah, I mean,
left.
the communist infiltrators in the American government, which they certainly were the people who were spurned by Stalin, not his agents.
Yeah, exactly. And Besmanov just doesn't get that, and he doesn't understand the history that preceded him. So he's kind of, I don't know, like whatever he was saying, the CIA was already doing at least a decade, well, 2 decades at least before he showed up on the scene. But
Yeah,
it's
there
kind
was
of like
this
what
actual,
concern.
and we discussed this. There was this strange inversion in the '60s where a lot of KGB rabble rousers, as you were, operating within the states, were inadvertently carrying the water for the CIA because they were trying to create this weird hippie movement and pump all these people full of LSD. The KGB thought like, oh, if we can introduce this in the American public, we could lead to some instability and chaos. But it's like it was more like Langley was thanking them for doing the hard work for them. So it is actually one of the funnier instances in recent history that I think that they sort of inadvertently played into the hands of these people. Yeah, but that's all I had in
Yeah.
regard to that. If you have
Yeah, the
anything
only
to
thing
add.
I want to add to what you said, which was perfect, was um, it's in many sort of conservative right-wing Westerners' minds, right? Like they feel deeply, deeply attached to the concepts of, a constitutional nation, democracy, um, capitalism, especially, and these are like sacred for them, which is sad because it just kind of shows how deep what do kind of simping, right? Like none of these things could ever lead to where they are. It must always have been an external pressure, like an external infiltration, right? So they begin simping for these concepts
And
that they
it
think are
is
the
a
same
weird
thing as a
mirror
country.
of a lot of these very ideologically very theory obsessed communists, where it's like. Uh, of course, it must have been somebody else. Stalin must have been an outside infiltrator because it wasn't John Lennon's Imagine by the time we were done with the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's this very weird mirror image of each other.
Yeah, yeah. So I always find that hilarious. They can like I mean I have two friends that are like that. And then when you tell them stuff about like World War I, like I mentioned, Woodrow Wilson, initially funding the revolution, like the whole thing is to destabilize. I know they sent forces there to then try to stop, so quote unquote stop the revolution, but that was just to drag it out, so it inflicted the most amount of damage by prolonging the war. And then when they hear about like they go on and on about the Frankfurt School, and they know nothing about the details. And anyhow, it's a kind of simping. It's a coping mechanism, and it's also, I think, a lot of those same people also, like, there's a good portion of them that think like everything can be redeemed, like everything can still be turned around. And you would have to simp like that in order to believe that.
It's
You
this
have to.
it's this strange residual love for liberalism, which I think that many
Yes.
people have brought themselves to cast off. I can say I personally have. I imagine many in the audience personally have. But there's this certain subset of people, and even if it's subconscious, who think that these liberal values have some intrinsic worth beyond, again, whatever temporary purpose they served. And of course, it they simply don't. And I'll be the first to say that. And you're not a nation, you're not a civilization when you're built on abstract values. And again, I will admit there are some liberal principles, very few, but a few I do agree with. But I don't think these things are ultimate, eternal, and unchangeable truths. I
Or
think that
universal.
yeah, I think that these things might be convenient for society. For example, I'll use this as an example. I think, for example, the concept of free speech and free expression is a good pressure valve for society and may prevent some violent outbursts. But I don't have this higher principle dedication or this religious dedication to the concept of free speech. I think that, and this might gather me some heat. In some cases, censorship is necessary. I'll take a recent example. I mean, when Poland shut down those, LGBTQ CIA defamation of Christian iconography, I thought that was great. But again, uh, we're getting off on a bit of a
Hmm,
tangent
hmm,
here. But
hmm.
just in conclusion, as I would end a high school essay, Russia, Ukraine not going to war. Ukraine has egg on its face, and just to touch on the point from earlier, I could believe that a lot of high profile figures are leaving, quote unquote, leaving Ukraine as, again, just trying to keep the show up. But I do believe there's also plenty who have saw how much of a ridiculous fiasco this has become, and they decided that they just want to cash out of this project and go live in Tel Aviv or London or Paris or
Yeah, I
New
mean,
York.
it's bit if there's no war tomorrow or the day after, let's say, then really, like, America's gay op is responsible for, like, economically endangering or even crashing Ukraine, right? Like, like, they've taken out all their trainers and special forces, every one of these countries that have pledged support. And I mean, what does that say? Like, really? Um, and every time that Zelensky pleaded with them not to scare the public, because it was having, not just for morale, but it was having terrible consequences on their banks. And now you've got basically love them or hate them, you've got the oligarchs leaving. They're taking their money out. So five more oligarchs have taken their money out of Ukrainian banks, and this is terrible. So yeah, well, I mean, what was the point of this? Again, like I said, two basic theories is they wanted a resolution where nobody would have to comply with Minsk by having a military solution to the Donbass, and or keep Germany down by canceling Nord Stream 2.
That's really what it all comes down to now, isn't it? And there's only so much we can say until the moment of truth comes, when Russia simply does not invade Ukraine. So there's only so much we can say since then. But in the slim chance they do, again, we don't have much to talk about otherwise. And
Mhm.
um, that's all I had for this episode. Unless you have any surprise last minute stories.
No, I don't. I'm not hearing anything from St. Petersburg.
Uh, uh, that is interesting. That is where our handlers are based out of, and
Yes.
once again, I've been talking with our good handler out of St. Petersburg. We're trying to arrange something insofar as that is concerned. Hopefully, we can have him on sooner than later because he is about due for an appearance. But That is just how it goes sometimes. And once again, the war report ends in a complete tangent. But I suppose that's why you guys tune in now, isn't it? Again, I think we like to buck the traditional formula a little. At least I like to think so. And you guys seem to enjoy it. I know last episode was atrociously long, so I'm just gonna
Yeah.
cut us off here at
We'll
about an
spare you.
hour and a half. So we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care, guys.